I'm John Hawthorne. I'm professor of sociology at Spring Arbor University, and this was sort of my idea, I guess, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm pleased to be joined by Kristen DeMay in history here from Calvin, by Roger Olson, whose name I think is I put it in, but if you look at the program, my email address dropped down to the next line, which I think moved Roger's name down to the next block, which didn't happen. So I take the blame for Roger's name being missing in the program. Professor of theology, you probably have a name for professor of theology, I don't know what the name is.
I think it was providential that my name got left.
Okay. Roger, professor of theology at Truett Seminary at Baylor, and Marie Esselstein, who is professor of political science at Indiana University Northwest. So in the first year of my teaching career, which is, I'm not saying this about Marie, I was saying we were talking about how long ago that was for me. I was invited to go to this conference on congregational life. Pew had put up a bunch of money and brought people in, and it was this conference at Candler Seminary at Emory. And what had happened is there were a couple people, Bob and Alice Evans had done a case study of this little church in kind of rural Massachusetts and how it had gone through the struggles of this little town, and things had shifted, and they had their ups and downs, and how do we understand this congregation? And their case study materials were then given to a team of scholars. And so the presentation began by Bob and Alice laying out the story of this church, and then right after that, a pair of sociologists reflected on what they saw in that case study and what that was about, how that worked for them. And then a pair of organizational psychologists talked about the case study and what they drew out of the case study. And a pair of anthropologists talked about what they saw in the case study and what they drew out of that. And then a couple of theologians, that was the other one. And then a couple of theologians did the same thing. And it was one of the most remarkable experiences of hearing the way in which different disciplinary eyes can look at the same thing and see some overlapping themes, but some unique and kind of special themes, and together to kind of get the full picture of what happened in this church. So as I say, this has been something that has kind of lived with me for my entire career. I tell people this was the most remarkable experience I was in, my favorite conference ever. This is close second. My favorite conference ever. And so when I saw the call for proposals, actually I wrote Kevin and I said, I have this weird idea. What do you think about me doing something like that great conference I did? Well, might fall a little short because we don't have the same funding. And so this is what we're going to try to do. I've asked these colleagues to reflect on the last 2.5 to 4 years, depending on if you want to think about this, whether it's the whole campaign cycle, but certainly the whole focus on what's going on with evangelicals and politics. What did we think we knew at the time when people were writing the quick pieces to follow on last night? The quick pieces, here's the quick analysis of what we think we know about evangelicals and politics, particularly around the Trump election, and where has our thinking gone in the time that's gone by? Where are we now? And then we'll kind of wrap up with and then where are we going? So I'm going to sit down and we're going to kind of walk in order as they kind of come up and share their reflections, Kristen and then Roger and then Marie, and then I'll take the cleanup spot, and then we'll sit down and we'll kind of explore where we think this takes us and what we learned from listening to each other. So, and then after I ask a couple of questions, we'll kind of open it to the floor. So that's the plan. So, Kristen, the mic is yours.
Okay, I am going to bring the historian's view. Historians have been talking quite a lot, historians of American religion at least, about the election of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's election and the purported support of some 81% of white evangelicals has opened up a rift in the field of American religious history. Or perhaps more accurately, it has revealed deep fault lines that were already there. At issue first is the legitimacy of this 81%, or 80% if you prefer. Some scholars and some evangelical leaders want to contest this figure, and it's important here to understand that these categories overlap, scholars and evangelical leaders. They blame pollsters and pundits for getting things wrong. Even before Trump secured the nomination, white evangelical leaders were contesting purported levels of evangelical support. Russell Moore, for example, insisted that the word evangelical had become almost meaningless. A big part of the problem was the media and the pollsters, who relied on self-identification. Many who tell pollsters they are evangelical may well be drunk right now, he said, and haven't been into a church since someone invited them to Vacation Bible School sometime back when Seinfeld was in first-run episodes. When the dust settled after the election, Moore said, the time would come to make evangelicalism great again. During the week of the Republican National Convention, evangelical historian Tommy Kidd echoed these sentiments in the Washington Post. He expressed frustration with time-strapped pollsters who just let people tell them that they are evangelicals without probing what that means. Somehow, an entire generation of Americans had gotten the wrong idea about evangelicalism. A pop culture definition had usurped a proper historical and theological one, resulting in large numbers of supposed evangelicals who had no clue about the formal definition of evangelical. Ultimately, then, the question of evangelical support for Trump hinges on definitions. To be a real evangelical, according to evangelical leaders and according to many historians of evangelicalism, is not a matter of self-identification. Evangelicalism is not a name it and claim it sort of thing. Rather, it is about fitting a formal definition, by which they mean the Bebington Quadrilateral: biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism. In fact, in the midst of the 2016 election, establishment evangelicals were pushing back against self-identification as a measure of evangelicalism by conducting their own polls. Ed Stetzer of Lifeway Research and Leith Anderson of the NAE teamed up to do just this, and they were very open about their motives. They wanted to disrupt two faulty notions, that evangelical means white, and that evangelicals are primarily defined by their politics. By defining evangelicalism by belief and basing their model on Bebington, they ended up with a much more diverse evangelicalism. 29% of whites end up in this category, along with 44% of African Americans and 30% of Hispanics. It's not hard to see how this might change the narrative when it comes to evangelical politics. If evangelicalism is defined by a set of theological commitments, then one can find evangelicals the world over. And the significance of American nationalism to evangelical identity diminishes for obvious reasons. Additionally, if the movement is far less white than is generally assumed, it clearly cannot be primarily motivated by racism or whiteness. Stetzer and Anderson highlighted these racial dynamics by quoting African-American scholar Anthea Butler. In a speech at Fuller Seminary in 2015, Butler had complained that Bible-believing Black evangelicals were too often ignored. She was, in effect, staking a claim on evangelicalism, and she wasn't alone. Last August, you may have noticed, a press release proclaiming that evangelical women had hit the pause button on the culture wars. Maybe you missed that. But just who were these evangelical women? In addition to Jen Hatmaker and Rachel Held Evans, whose evangelical credentials were up for grabs, many who signed were women of color: Brenda Salter McNeil, Latasha Morrison, Kathy Kong, Christina Edmondson. Again, people of color staking a claim on evangelicalism. But evangelicals of color have an ambivalent relationship with evangelicalism. There is a reason why a recent Lifeway survey found that only 25% of African Americans who ascribe to the 4 points of evangelical belief actually identified as evangelicals. Black Christians have long resisted the evangelical label because it is clear to them that there is more to evangelical identity than 4 statements of belief. In the words of Deirdre Riggs, evangelicalism is a white religious brand. It's worth noting that when Anderson and Stetzer quoted Butler to argue for a more expansive definition of evangelicalism, they did so selectively, because in that same speech, Butler went on to decry evangelicalism's problem of whiteness and to call out white evangelical scholars' inability or unwillingness to confront that problem. Bebbington's 4 points, Butler asserted, are in fact culturally and racially specific. Now, another matter of dispute when it comes to evangelical support for Trump revolves around the question of church attendance. Many in this room have probably followed ongoing debates on this topic. Early on, evangelicals liked to point to a survey conducted during the primary season that showed that church-going Republicans were less likely to support Trump than were devout Republicans. And this data point helped build a case that real evangelicals preferred candidates other than Trump. In fact, at this time, evangelicals like Kidd and Moore suggested that there could be no such thing as a non-church-going evangelical. But then a survey conducted in June of 2016 revealed that church-going Republicans voters were at least as likely to support Trump as those who attended services less than once a week, and subsequent polling has shown strong support for Trump among those who attend church the most, and interestingly, the least, the kind of two polls. Now, to further muddy the waters, when it comes to evangelical identity, we must also contend with high levels of theological illiteracy. A recent Lifeway survey, for example, found that less than half of those who self-identify as evangelicals strongly agree with core evangelical beliefs. Many evangelicals, in fact, hold heretical beliefs, including presumably many who attend church, and many, I can attest, who go to Christian colleges. So this leads us to a critical question. When a large number of people who self-identify as evangelicals fail to ascribe to what some scholars have dictated to be the essential tenets of evangelicalism, does that mean that they are not actually evangelicals? Or does it suggest that something else has come to define evangelicalism, at least for them? And this is where the divide emerges. For historians trained in cultural history and cultural modes of analysis, the study of race, gender, power, the fact that evangelical identity can't be reduced to theological distinctives is so obvious as to barely need to be spoken. In fact, among many of these historians, there's a bit of soul-searching going on, looking back at their own recent writings, questioning whether or not they missed or improperly de-emphasized factors like misogyny, racism, and the like. But among a number of historians who have long dominated the historiography of American evangelicalism, there's a resistance to this shift. And here the conversation often comes down not only to definitions, with a strong preference for theological distinctives and for behavioral requirements such as church attendance, but also to a debate over what constitutes the margins and what constitutes the mainstream. Who occupies the center of evangelicalism? Do Ed Stetzer and Russell Moore? Or do Jerry Falwell Jr. and Franklin Graham? Or perhaps Wayne Grudem and John Piper? Or Beth Moore and Karen Swallow Pryor? And who gets to decide who occupies the center? In other words, who gets to define who is in and who is out? Now, last year, historian Tim Glegg took issue with evangelicals who claimed current manifestations of evangelicalism do not reflect the true essence of evangelicalism. He found it troubling that a group of media-savvy evangelicals was poised to dictate the terms of our national conversation, and asserted that evangelicals' insider definitions reflected a religious agenda rather than careful analysis. To Glegg, it was clear that the 4 points of the Bebbington Quadrilateral simply do not translate into identifiable patterns of belief and practice. Take biblicism. Who determines which Christians take the Bible seriously? Do Rob Bell and Rachel Held Evans count? They once did, but then having come up with the wrong and thus unbiblical answers about hell and about being gay, they've been defined outside the fold. Biblicism, Glegg concludes, is nothing more than evangelical gerrymandering. He doesn't mince words. Instead of spurring self-reflection, the Bebbington Quadrilateral allows evangelicals to ignore hard questions while the movement they helped conjure burns down the country. It's worth noting again that many historians of evangelicalism who center respectable evangelicalism are themselves respectable evangelicals. They are, in the words of Fred Clark, faculty lounge evangelicals. And the vast majority of these are also white men, which does not disqualify them, I hasten to add. But observing this divide within the profession, and admittedly as an active participant in this debate, I found it fascinating to reflect on the positionality of scholars. I think it's also fair to say that scholars who are not white and male are more experienced in reflecting on their own positionality. In a sense, this larger question of margins and mainstream brings us back to the mid-century rise of neo-evangelicalism out of the ashes of fundamentalism. But fundamentalism, of course, didn't really go away, and evangelicalism wasn't ever entirely separate from fundamentalism. And today, Wheaton, Christianity Today, and the NAE are not located at the centers of this movement. Just ask folks at any of these institutions. What then does constitute the center of evangelicalism? Or perhaps more fundamentally, if we don't define evangelicalism by a static set of theological distinctives, how should we approach this movement that, due to its rejection of denominational identity, its entrepreneurial spirit, and lack of clear authority structures, is notoriously difficult to define? In my own research on evangelical masculinity and militarism, rather than attempting to define evangelicalism in terms of timeless precepts, I found it more fruitful to think of evangelicalism as a dynamic network of individuals, organizations, and alliances, and ultimately as a culture of consumption. Over the past half century or more, evangelicals have produced and consumed a vast quantity of religious products: Christian books, Christian contemporary music, Christian radio and television programs, feature films, ministry conferences, blogs, t-shirts, and home decor. A little shout out to my Hobby Lobby evangelicalism there. Many evangelicals who would be hard-pressed to articulate even the most basic tenets of evangelical theology have nonetheless been immersed in this consumer culture. In this evangelicalism, James Dobson, Joshua Harris, and the Duck Dynasty clan play a larger role than Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield currently do, or even Ed Stetzer and Leith Anderson. As a consumer culture, evangelicalism has an expansive reach. One need not attend a traditional evangelical church to participate in this religious culture. One need not attend church at all. Cultural evangelicalism, too, has made deep inroads into mainline Christianity, to the point that characterizing members of a denomination like the UMC as mainliners obscures more than it reveals. Evangelicalism as a consumer culture is not entirely disconnected from establishment evangelicalism. Evangelical theologians, leaders, and organizations generate much of the religious content that is marketed to a vast congregation of consumers. At times, however, evangelical popular culture can subvert the authority of the evangelical elite. During the Trump campaign, many pastors were surprised to find that they wielded little influence over people in the pews. What they didn't realize was that they were up against a more powerful system of authority, an evangelical subculture that reflected and reinforced a compelling ideology and a coherent worldview. Rather than seeking to distinguish real from supposed evangelicals, then, it is more useful to think in terms of the degree to which individuals participate in this evangelical culture of consumption. Understanding evangelicalism as a cultural movement places less emphasis on church attendance and doctrinal literacy. It also gives us tools for exploring differences across race and ethnicity, because the evangelical market is frequently divided along racial lines. And I think it can also allow for a more dynamic analysis of global evangelicalism. So let's pause here for a moment and ask, who is right? Is evangelicalism a theological category or a consumer culture, a diverse global movement, or a white religious brand? What if the answer is all of the above? Here I find it useful to borrow a page from Benedict Anderson's scholarship on nationalism and suggest that we consider evangelicalism as an imagined religious community. There are, in fact, many evangelicalisms, and each is imagined with a different center and different boundaries. If we consider evangelicalism as an imagined community, we must pay close attention to questions of power. Theologians, organizations, leaders, pollsters, pundits, and distribution networks all imagine evangelicalism in different ways. And one person might even imagine it in conflicting ways simultaneously, thinking of Anthea Butler here, using each for different rhetorical purposes, identifying with or against different imagined constructs. The primary question then isn't which definition is correct, but rather which imaginings have the more power to shape other people's imaginings. So when Lifeway Christian Books decides you are no longer an evangelical, it matters, at least if you want to sell books. When the evangelical left claims the mantle of evangelicalism to call for an end to the culture wars, it matters rhetorically. But beyond that, I'm not so sure. This shift in focus demands that scholars too examine our own positionality. How have scholars imagined evangelicalism, and to what end? Which imaginings have wielded power in the academy, and why? In closing, rather than seeking to impose one definition over all others, I think we should be more attentive to how evangelicalism has always been a dynamic, fluid movement or series of movements imagined and maintained through networks, alliances, and authority structures, each drawing and enforcing the boundaries of evangelicalism for varying purposes. And we will be forced to contend with how we, too, are implicated in this imaginative process.
Excuse me while I get my reading class.
I do have bifocals, but they don't work. Can I put this down there? I apologize. I'm not sure I understood exactly what the assignment was, so I'm just going to take off. And you get what you get. So my title is What Have We Learned? Evangelical Theologians in the Trump Era. My assigned task, I thought, is briefly to talk about evangelical theologians in the Trump era and what we have learned. There are a few fuzzy terms in this assignment that I must clarify so you, my audience, know what I mean. First, who are we? Does the question that is my task refer to evangelicals in general, or evangelical theologians, or some other group? And here I am going to focus on evangelical theologians. Another question raised by the we is nationality. I will interpret we as referring to American evangelical theologians, although I believe that evangelicalism is a worldwide phenomenon. Second, what does learned mean? It may seem obvious, but as a university professor for almost 40 years, and as a student for many years before that, I can assure you that learned is not as clear as it may seem. To be brief, it seems to me that we cannot really have learned anything definitively yet. Hopefully, we are learning some things. Third, to what group of people or even theologians does evangelical refer? This is, of course, to raise the hair-raising question of who is an evangelical. Let me remind everyone that the vast majority of evangelicals live outside the United States, and the vast majority are not theologians in any formal sense of the word. For purposes of fulfilling my task, I will restrict myself to talking about theologians in the United States who generally agree with the National Association of Evangelicals statement of faith, and who are generally recognized as belonging to the Guild of Evangelical Theologians. And I realize how fuzzy that is, but I don't know how else to approach it. Fourth, for my purposes here and now, I consider a theologian someone who is widely regarded as a theologian, whether he or she holds an earned doctorate in theology or not. Remember that Karl Barth never earned a doctorate in theology. Neither did Reinhold Niebuhr. Fifth and finally, I treat Trump era as extending from June 2015 to today. Now on with my thoughts about evangelical theologians in the Trump era and what we are learning. First and foremost, perhaps most controversially, I think we are learning that the vast majority of evangelical theologians either lack the courage to speak out against Trump and Trumpism, defined as Trump's distinctive policies and leadership style, or lack discernment about their dangers, or have succumbed to a great delusion. Too few evangelical theologians have dared to speak out publicly against Trump and Trumpism, which are blatantly contrary to the values of the kingdom of God and to America's own historical democratic values. I called for an American church struggle, a Kirchenkampf, similar to the confessing church in Germany in the 1930s, and my calls have mostly fallen on deaf ears. It makes me wonder if I am just a Chicken Little, or if I am more discerning than most of my peers in the evangelical theological community. I am profoundly grieved that more evangelical leaders and especially theologians have not spoken out forcefully enough to be heard in the churches and in the media. Or have they, and somehow the churches and the media have simply chosen to ignore us? I believe that one thing some of us are learning is what it felt like to be Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1935. Sure, no Night of the Long Knives has happened, at least so far as we know. But how many Germans knew about that? Nevertheless, the danger of nationalistic tyranny is at least on the visible horizon, and too few evangelical theologians have looked up and spoken out publicly about it. On a more mundane and less controversial level, perhaps, I think we are learning that the label evangelical is quickly becoming difficult to hold without being perceived as a supporter of Trump and his Make America Great Again nationalistic campaign. I wonder, however, if we are also learning that many Americans consider themselves evangelical in some vacuous sense of identifying with the Make America Great ideology with a thin veneer of conservative Christianity thrown over it. Is it possible that almost 100 million Americans are evangelicals? Imagine a rapture like that. Seriously, as an evangelical theologian, I find it difficult to believe that true, authentic evangelical Christianity is as common as poll takers say, or that it is only white, as many sociologists claim. To me, the majority of African American Christians in the United States are evangelicals, in the only sense I recognize and acknowledge, which is spiritual, theological. So now let me turn to some specifics. Who are the evangelical theologians who have spoken out publicly either in acclaim or criticism of Trump and Trumpism? Very interestingly, two very conservative, Calvinistic, influential evangelical theologians who agree about almost everything else have broken over Trump and Trumpism. One is Russell Moore, head of the Southern Baptist-related Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, former Associate Dean of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and close associate of the seminary's conservative president, Al Mohler. Surprisingly, to many observers both within and outside of evangelical ranks, Moore has criticized Trump and many of his policies and actions. I happen to know from reliable sources that he was called on the carpet for that by leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, but that doesn't seem to have silenced him. On the other hand, Moore's conservative evangelical counterpart in Arizona, theologian Wayne Grudem, is also one of the most influential theologians in America, but has mostly supported Trump and his policies, if not all of his actions. Grudem's reasons are the usual and expected ones for evangelical Trump supporters: to see conservative and friendly judges appointed to the Supreme and other federal courts. Ultimately, hopefully, to see Roe versus Wade and the Obergefell versus Hodges decisions overturned, or at least gutted. Unlike the popular press, I am going to set aside consideration of the most notable evangelical leaders who support Trump and Trumpism because I don't consider them theologians. But one thing I am learning is how little the popular press and journalists think of theologians. when they look to popular megachurch pastors and presidents of fundamentalist universities to speak for all evangelicals. A few other evangelical theologians besides Moore have spoken out against Trump and Trumpism. Among them are popular pastor theologian Greg Boyd of St. Paul, Minnesota, who has frequently tweeted and blogged about Trump, and almost always in a critical way. Of course, many will brush Boyd aside as irrelevant, since he does not think Christians should participate directly in politics anyway, and dismisses the whole idea of a Christian nation. I don't think that is fair to brush him aside, but it's a real reason his voice does not carry as much weight as it should. Scott McKnight of Northern Seminary in suburban Chicago has also spoken out against Trump on his blog and in interviews. However, because of Trump and the popular association of evangelicalism with Trumpism, McKnight has declared that he can no longer consider himself an evangelical. So there he goes. But I wouldn't dismiss him from this conversation entirely, as I still consider him a true evangelical. Many non-theologian evangelical scholars have spoken out against Trump and Trumpism, but I won't mention them, except John Fee of Messiah College as an example. In my considered opinion, if the Evangelical Theological Society, with its thousands of members, is good for anything, it ought to step up and speak out loudly with one voice against at least the worst excesses of Trumpist nationalism. So should the National Association of Evangelicals. But let me end this survey of some things we are learning about evangelical theologians and evangelicalism in America in the Trump era with mention of one bright point of light. During the election campaign of 2016, a group of evangelical theologians and leaders did write and sign a declaration of American evangelicals concerning Donald Trump. The declaration sounded a clarion call of warning about Trump's leadership style and nationalistic policies. It was written by a committee led by former NAE executive Richard Cizik and published October 6, 2016, just days before the presidential election. 75 evangelicals leaders signed it initially, and hundreds signed it later, as it was online and open to signatures. The declaration warned very incisively, very strongly, about the latent racist tendencies in Trumpism. Several national news publications, including the New York Times, briefly took notice of the declaration. And then American journalism and popular media went back to identifying evangelicalism with Trumpism as the bean counters took over. So what does it mean to me as an evangelical theologian that 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election? As one who believes in original sin and total depravity, I'm not surprised. Even the best Christians are not immune to deceit and delusion. Many God-fearing, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving German Christians supported Hitler wholeheartedly. The Bible teaches us the human heart is deceitful and wicked. Theologian Karl Barth famously declared that the greatest delusion of all is that we can disillusion ourselves. On the other hand, I am not convinced that all of those 80% were truly, authentically evangelical, just because they claim to have had a born-again experience. Hopefully, being evangelical is thicker than that. Again, however, on the other hand, it is not beyond possible that 80% of self-identified evangelicals, even true, authentic evangelicals, are blind to Trump's corruption and dangerous tendencies. Is there a nearly fatal weakness in American evangelicalism that explains our present predicament? Yes, there are several, and perhaps many. I could talk about the prevalence of folk religion over serious biblical and theological knowledge and understanding. I could talk about the heresy of American exceptionalism that has been endemic to American Protestantism in general. But I think the most fatal of all weaknesses in our American evangelical proneness is America's evangelical proneness to triumphalism. We are always too attracted to a potential leader who seems to favor us, even if that is an obvious ploy to gain millions of supporters. We have always wanted to own American culture, not necessarily for the cause of the kingdom of God as Jesus embodied and taught it. Too many self-identified evangelicals here give America back to white evangelicals when they hear "Make America Great Again." To me, this is heresy and ought to be named as such. Too few white American evangelical leaders, including theologians, are doing that loudly enough. I have done it on my blog. Very few have noticed. But the din of evangelical support for Trump drowns out our few and feeble voices. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I took a very different approach to this task, maybe one that was much more laid back and much more straightforward. So we were asked if evangelicals were a voting bloc, and when you have 4 out of 5 evangelicals voting for Trump, I would suggest that that's a voting bloc. I think the thing to keep in mind, thinking about political science and vote choice, is that national elections are primarily a binary choice. So you can have 4 out of 5 people, evangelicals, voting for Donald Trump. They are not necessarily voting for him for all the same reasons. I think about this as a Supreme Court decision, where you can have 7 justices with the majority opinion, and then you see all of their side opinions, right? Where they're like, yes, I agreed with the majority, but not on this point. I voted yes because of these things, right, over here. So I think that there's diversity, right, in that voting bloc, but yes, when 4 out of 5 white evangelicals vote for Donald Trump, I think that we can call that a voting bloc. We were also asked, you had sent some information, about what explains the switch on the importance of moral leadership. And so we were given some data, this question about the importance of moral leadership. And in 2011, there was, far more evangelicals who said that this is important than they did in 2016. And again, this takes me back to the point of national elections being predominantly a binary choice. So it seems as if this is very situational, right? That the importance of moral leadership is now switching depending on what sort of choices one is being offered. I think that there was, early on in 2016, this belief that white evangelicals were voting for Donald Trump because of the Supreme Court. They wanted to make sure that Roe was overturned, or I don't know if I'm saying it right, Obergefell, right? That they weren't happy with this decision. And it's not that no one thought about the Supreme Court at all, but I think that there is a considerable amount of opinion, survey data that shows that the biggest issues driving voting for Donald Trump among white evangelicals were terrorism, national security, the economy, immigration, foreign policy, and then sometime after that, right, I'm reading these in order, comes the issue of Supreme Court justices. So again, it's not that this wasn't a factor, it's just that it wasn't the one that was at the top of the list driving this vote choice. At the risk of being the outlier here, when I took a look at the research in terms of political science, like where we were in 2016 and where we are now, it seems to me as if the narrative started off, and I will concede that President Donald Trump and candidate Donald Trump, he is an unpolished, he speaks in a manner that most of us don't, right? But the narrative is that he's a racist, Islamophobe, anti-immigrant. And it seems to me, when I take a look at the survey of research that's done in political science, the quest has been to confirm that. So the voting choice, there is a voluminous literature on vote choice in political science. And there's issue proximity theory. So there could be studies in political science that say, hey, what were the biggest issues and what's this issue proximity, and what did people think, white evangelicals, in terms of issue proximity versus Trump versus Clinton, And where does this fall out? But I haven't seen those studies. Instead, what I've seen are all the studies that say the white nationalists, the racists, the anti-immigrants, the Islamophobes, these are all the people voting for Trump. Man, that's just a lot of racists in this country. And I, for one, as I walk around this country, don't feel like as if I am surrounded by racists on every side. And I think that we need to really be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves if race and gender and being against immigrants and being Islamophobes, if all of these negatives is what explains everything, maybe it really doesn't explain that much at all. That this preference for putting everything into these are all negative attributes. And so is it any wonder that white evangelicals vote for Trump? I think that there's a very reactionary measure going on. I think if I recognize Guth, James, right? You have a paper on populism, right, with CalStat at this conference. And talking about populism, distrust of political elites and institutions, and concerns with national decline. And I think that, yeah, this gets at it, right? Because what you have is a group of people being told, well, if you say that you believe in one man and one woman for marriage, you're a homophobe. If you say that, gee, I think Somalia ought to be on a travel ban because they have no functioning government, they've been in total chaos, and by the way, we've actually had military incursions there, you're an Islamophobe. So it's like as if no one can bring up these issues without being told that they are racists or is Islamophobe, or if you suggest that maybe it's just not fair that there is one set of immigration rules if you can come across our southern border illegally versus if you live on the other side of the Pacific or the Atlantic. That we shouldn't have two parallel systems of how we make people legal citizens. Deferred action for childhood arrivals. I mean, when would that end? I mean, because if if you constantly have a flow of illegals coming here as children, then you're constantly going to have to do that. And is it okay to say, is that fair? Is that fair to other people? There's like 7 billion people on this planet. Is it fair for all the people over in Vietnam or China or anywhere else that might want to come here that doesn't have access to our southern border? And to be immediately shut down that you are an anti-immigrant, if you dare suggest that maybe that's a policy issue that you are concerned with, that maybe that policy issue drives crime, that maybe that policy issue drives drug trafficking, that maybe that policy issue drives fundings for schools and hospitals and local communities that are impacted by it. The whole conversation gets shut down by this discussion of you're a racist Islamophobe. Oh, okay. So, I think that, so I go back to, I think it's reasonable for white evangelicals to say, on every front, they're being told they are racists. That, if they say that they want, an improved immigration system, then they're against immigrants. If they say that they want more vetting for who comes over here from Middle Eastern countries, then they're Islamophobes. And so I think that we can view this somewhat as a reaction that that they see themselves being backed into a corner, right? That there are viewpoints that they can't have without being told they do not belong in civil society. Because, who wants to allow a racist in, right? So I do see this as very reactionary. I'll end this with, I have a colleague that I've published with, and he's actually a sociologist. And he's African-American professor of sociology. He's at the University of North Texas, George Yancey. And he actually just got an offer from Baylor, and will be going there soon. And he used to publish on race. So he started off his career doing all sorts of studies on race. And what he said to me was that as a black man saying that there were problems with racial discrimination in this country, he was applauded. His research was fawned over. He now studies Christian phobia. And he has some very compelling research about the negative attitudes and prejudices against people who hold the Christian faith, especially, evangelicals. And he says, hands down, it's easier to be a black man studying race in academia than it is to be a black man studying Christian phobia and being an open Christian. And I think that says a lot.
Thank you. This has exactly the kind of minimal overlap I was hoping for. So let me share some thoughts of my own. I want to reflect a little bit on kind of setting the context for a sociological look at the question of evangelicals and the recent voting. And there are a number of things in here that have been said by my colleagues that I want to come back and unpack when we're sitting down in discussion. But first of all, I want to sort of try to put the question about political alignment kind of in the right context. Yes, 81%, I mean, without getting into whether they were real evangelicals or not, the self-ID is 81% exit polls. We have that data. Now, that was new for Trump, and maybe the question for Trump became the morality question. How could that be, given everything everybody saw about Trump, and why didn't evangelicals say this? But the trend line for the alignment between evangelicals and voting Republican in presidential elections had been trending upward since '04. Fairly, little jumps at a time, but we only went from 78 to 81 between 12 and 16. So some of this was not about, oh my goodness, they're all Republicans. Yes, they are. That's not news. There's also the question embedded in that PRI data that Marie mentioned, where it showed that the question is, does a candidate's personal morality, influence kind of what kind of a leader you think they'd be? And in 2011, 70% of even white evangelicals said the answer to that question was yes, that would be of influence. And in 2016, only 30% said yes. Right? So why did that happen? There was a different president at the time, I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. But there is that kind of shift, and maybe that has something to do with a sense of pragmatism within the evangelical voter, that their preference may have been a morality question, but I think it's also true, and Kristen could explore this a little more deeply perhaps, that there were such baked-in views of the inherent immorality of Hillary Rodham Clinton that there may have been some kind of a comparative choice going on. So it's true that the white evangelicals overwhelmingly supported Trump in the 2016 election. That reporting glosses the fact that majorities of white mainliners and white Catholics voted for Trump as well. So evangelicals have gotten a bit of an unfair degree of attention in that it's like, if it wasn't for all you evangelicals, he would be, mathematically that may be true, but and then the issue that I personally have been wrestling with on this whole evangelical debate, and I've talked to several of you about it here this weekend, there has been a presumption that theological values are playing a role in people's voting choices. That evangelicals, because they hold this set of beliefs, would vote in this particular way. And I've been recently trying to find any indications that people are operationalizing theological concepts when they're considering voting behavior. I think that's a variable phenomenon, and I'm really interested in kind of trying to dig into that. As I've told several of you, that I'm now cursed with the fact that the passion for my next book has occurred when I'm halfway through this book, and I don't know what to do about it. So, the early research in terms of what came in sociology, what came out right after the election, kind of glossed sort of the normal things. There was an assumption that racial identity was highlighted given given candidate Trump's rhetoric, Muslims, Hispanic, maybe rapists, some are nice people. That was racial identity questions, especially as it became addressed to Latinx and Muslim groups, seemed to be a driving force. And so there was a lot of race was the primary driver, and there was authoritarianism as the primary driver. There's some interesting research on white working class voters, and demonstrates that there is actually a move toward Trump between 12 and 16 among a segment of white working class folks. It's a small move, right? And with the margin of the election in, these states, these 3 states, one could argue that was important, but it's a small move. Most Republicans across categories supported Trump, whether they were narrow working class, white working class, left behind economic distress people or not. So it's not that there's nothing to the economic stress argument, it's just not a big argument, right? There is research that talked about sexism being at the fore. And if there's anything that I think we learned coming out of the election is that that was a significantly kind of under-addressed issue in reporting. I mean, how we ever would parse how much of the vote in 2016 was an anti-Clinton vote among evangelicals as opposed to a pro-Trump vote, and you get that some of the never Trumpers, some of the almost Trumpers, all those kinds of things. There are, of course, the specific issues others have already addressed. Roe, Obergefell, Supreme Court judges hopefully make a change. I think in recent years, as I was preparing for this, we begin to see some slightly more nuanced picture that doesn't begin to treat all evangelicals as a clump, but begins to look at patterns within them and really within the broader religious market that might help us understand a little more of what's going on. Gerard Marti had a piece in the Sociological Religion Journal this spring where he was sharing his own reflections on the work of Brophy on shifts of concerns about orthodoxy and orthopraxy, of belief and practice, and that there was, given the changes in society, a sense of threat. And when there's this perceived sense of threat going on, that there is a subsequent move from Weber's charismatic traditional authority of the church to the rational legal authority of the state. That we needed someone to come in and provide that leadership. This is not Gerardo, this is me, but thinking about that kind of sense of threat and needing somebody to step in, although this runs a little counter to the charismatic argument, this whole notion that Trump put God in office, that he's the modern Cyrus, or quoting Esther, that it is for such a time as this that this candidate would come along, would be another one of those indications that somehow this sense of threat, of perceived threat, of fear, required somebody to step in, and they might be abrasive, and it might not be your local pastor. We're not going to elect a president, not a pastor. For those of you who were in the session yesterday and saw Jim Guth's paper, that rough politics, strong leader, authoritarian troika was fascinating in this context. Then there's the Whitehead Perry Baker stuff on Christian nationalism, and that Christian nationalism is a driver within the evangelical bloc. They're not equivalent. Evangelicals are not Christian nationalists, but there is a home for Christian nationalists within evangelicalism. And we were looking here not just at concerns over religious freedom, but the assertion of distinctly Christian positions within the society, a strong, role for the state to play to maintain, preserve, reconstruct Christian values. In their research, they test their Christian nationalism. Well, first of all, Christian nationalism behaves in similar ways regardless of religious group. For white evangelicals, white Catholics, white mainliners, the trend lines are very close. There's minor difference between them, but very close together. When they control for all the other proposed explanatory variables, racism, sexism, economic anxiety, it all falls out. The only variable at the end of the day in their work that remains consistent that still survives when Christian nationalism is controlled is Islamophobia. So there's something going on there with that. The other thing that's going on, I think, has to do with the role of evangelicals within the broader culture. This is why, on the one hand, as Kristen mentions, we talk about the fact that real evangelicals only, if you use the Barna measure as the most conservative, real evangelicals are only 9%, right? But when Pew says it's 26%, the same evangelicals celebrate the fact they're bigger than other groups. And this is because, I believe, of a response to what Robbie Jones found in The End of White Christian America, that shifting demographic. This is a smaller and smaller population, the growth of the nuns, the growth of positions of color, has at least created the perception of diminished power, of loss of cultural voice, and puts the evangelical community increasingly on the defensive. So it's not so much a real threat as a perceived threat, or as a potential threat, as one in the future. This wasn't exactly about the Trump election. She dealt with it right at the end. But Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land was a wonderful book, if you haven't read it. She spent, so it's like going and living in Alabama. She spent 6 summers in Louisiana, hanging out in the bayou, talking to people. A Berkeley professor who spent 6 summers in Louisiana, and it's a wonderful book. But she has what she calls the deep story of kind of what has people so upset, these Tea Party years particularly. And she calls it the story of line cutters. That while we were plagued by the rules, these other folks, the women, the affirmative action, the immigrants, they all came in, they cut in line, and they called us names, and they told us we were stupid, and that we were heartless, and there were rules to this, and we feel cheated. So part of the argument, and I think we saw it in the rhetoric, and we see it today in the rhetoric, this is one of the president's favorite things. If Democrats get elected, things will be worse. So there's a defensive vote that's going on, because imagine what happens if they get their way. We're in favor of, Democrats, speaking as a Democrat, we're in favor of crime. We want open borders. We want, dangerous drug lords living in our houses, all of that, right? And so there's this fear that someone's going to do something. I find the weird discussion from the president about the Johnson Amendment to be a fascinating kind of microcosm of that thing. The Johnson Amendment has never been important, has never been a particular deal. No one has ever tried to come and say, Pastor, you can't talk about that. If anything, the data suggests that pastors aren't talking about that in the first place, and they don't know about the Johnson Amendment. But this notion that the Johnson Amendment is keeping you from living your faith, and this is the kind of thing they want to do to you, is a fear motivation. And perhaps this is, again, is where John's work in Believe Me comes in, that fear is just too easy of a move for evangelicals to make. So, what do I end with? Couple things. The continued rise in the nuns, now that they're the largest subset of religious identity, raises concerns and questions about where this all goes in the future. Pew's reports that only 8% of respondents under 30 self-identify as evangelicals, which is going to obviously change the dynamic long term. Secondly, it is becoming increasingly difficult and perhaps useless to try to separate white evangelicals from generic Republicans. as near as I've been tracking on virtually every poll you see, white evangelicals are within 2 percentage points of whatever generic Republicans are, and at some point we just need to stop trying to parse it. Right? As was mentioned last night, the continued issues of sex abuse, power play, and $900 and expensive sneakers in the evangelical church diminishes their sense of a power block. There's a lot of erosion going on, in part in the media, but also from within the evangelical community. There's a lot of self-reflection happening. And finally, religious vocabulary is being contested. Never Trump evangelicals regularly calling out what matters of faith look like. Progressives and Democrats apparently discovering a comfort level, rediscovering a comfort level of raising issues of faith, and the little tiff between Buttigieg and Pence. I wrote this before Graham decided to add his voice, but just Buttigieg and Pence on saying, here's what we believe, and here's what it means to be a Christian, and here's how I'm operationalizing my thoughts, kind of problematizes all these issues that were definitionally in some ways, or at least unexamined, and now they're out in front, and we're going to have to process them. So those are my thoughts, and I look forward to our conversations. Okay. I think I want to start with Kristen's imagined community and Marie's issue of the binary choice voting in presidential elections. Do evangelicals act as a unique group, or are they just enmeshed in their region, their culture, their economic condition, their economic anxieties, their concern about social change? Are they voting as evangelicals, or are they voting and happen to be evangelicals?
So ask a cultural historian a question for a political scientist. Are they voting as evangelicals? I think they're voting their values. And I really emphasize the role of cultural identity in shaping those values. And so, I think that survey data also has borne out that, I think you were the one who mentioned that economics, so let's just take that as an example, that economic motivations and this politics of resentment rooted in economic realities were not that salient. Mm-hmm. And but that doesn't mean that a culture of resentment, such as you were alluding to, is not a kind of mobilizing force. And what I found interesting in my research is, and this also applies to kind of urban-rural, or I would say suburban and rural, mm-hmm. and the affinities, the cultural affinities that are developed in the people that I look at, for example, the kind of valorization of rural values. Mm-hmm. So, this Hobby Lobby evangelicalism that I talk about, this God and country evangelicalism, rooted in a mythical kind of rural reality. But these are suburban white evangelicals who are buying fake, like farm fresh egg plaques to put on their kitchen wall, right? So there are a kind of ideological, cultural identity affinities that are developed across groups that may not share economic interests there. And so that's one of the things that I've really been fascinated with, and how the evangelical subculture really perpetuates these identities, sustains them, like provides communities of discourse, communities of meaning, where these values are very closely linked to what it means to be. what it means to be an evangelical, what it means to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that a lot of evangelicals, even though on a survey they might say, yeah, okay, I'll check that box. I kind of know what that means, and I'm an evangelical there. But when my students come my way, who go to some community church and then are shocked to discover when I force them to do research that, it happens to be a Baptist church, they don't have a strong self-awareness that they go to a Baptist church, or even this concept of evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the air they breathe. It's their Christianity. It's their American Christianity. So I guess that's kind of the way I would approach that question as a cultural historian watching this play out.
Yeah. Excuse me. I mean, I would concur just from an empirical standpoint. So as I said before, when you have 4 out of every 5 that are voting one way versus another, this is a voting block. And so there is something about that subculture of being evangelical, that they are voting as evangelicals. And we can look at this through all sorts of different voting groups. Jewish Americans tend to vote predominantly Democrat. African Americans tend to vote predominantly Democrat. So there's something then about, each of those particular groups that they are voting, like the majority of their group. And as I said before, they may be coming to the same choice for some different reasons. But I would say that they are voting as evangelicals.
So let me ask Roger a question. Because as I said, I've been wrestling with this. What would a theologically grounded vote look like?
I think that's an impossible question to answer. You have to be more specific. What kind of theologically grounded vote? I don't think there's such a thing as a generically theologically grounded vote, but if I had to answer that, I would say one that takes the theology of your own tradition seriously and applies it to politics. And I think the prophetic religion, and there are several prophetic religions, and Christianity ought to be a prophetic religion, is always going to be suspicious of power. And I think that in the current Trump era, 2015 to today, many so-called Christians have lost the prophetic suspicion of power. And that's part of what caused them to vote for Trump, because they simply overlooked the power rhetoric that he was using that I take seriously. And I have to compare it to the support of Hitler, although I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler. I'm comparing Christian support of Hitler with Christian support of Trump. People who supported Hitler simply did not believe what he said in Mein Kampf. They simply said he's changed, that he can't have meant what he wrote there. And he was also the only alternative to communism, they believed. They had bought into that fear that he was the only alternative to communism, and that once he got into power, he would have to play the game. He would have to compromise with the other parties, which they also said when they talked to Hindenburg about appointing him as chancellor and so forth. Well, none of that turned out to be true. I think they just were not they were not exercising the inbuilt suspicion of power of prophetic religion. And I think that's true of a lot of Christians in America today. They just are not suspicious of power. And they ought to be.
If anything, they may be jealous of.
Oh, absolutely. We want power.
Yeah.
And if I could put it bluntly, anyone who's more interested in America than in Jesus cannot be a real Christian.
With that, I will open it to the floor for questions and observations. Kevin.
So this is a question for Kristen, because we're on the same campus, but we don't talk. But no, I think you're onto something with this culturalist understanding of evangelicalism. But what I'm wondering about, and I think I can summarize my question by saying, how will I know that Duck Dynasty is evangelical? And so, in my own field, in political science, I think the most robust measures actually aren't about simply belief in practice, but it also includes social network, essentially. So patterns of affiliation.
Yes.
How do we belong together?
Absolutely.
So how would I recognize that if I'm trying to measure it?
Yes. Oh, I'm not good at telling you how to measure things, but I was with you up until that. So how do we know that Duck Dynasty is evangelical? They say it all the time, the Robertsons. Lifeway Books publishes over a dozen. There's a Duck Dynasty Commando Bible. There's, Sadie Robertson. So I ask, my incoming students, this is probably, I don't know, is it unethical? But I use them for research purposes all the time. What are you reading? What are you, devotionals? What, and I taught a course on women's spiritual memoir over interim, and had them, what books are kind of floating around in your world? And Sadie Robertson's was one of the books that we read, or at least a group of students read, and kind of dissected. And so, I look at, again, going back to this consumer culture, within evangelical distribution networks, so Lifeway is very one of the measures here, where what are people reading, what are people talking about, and then it gets a little bit murkier, but kind of taking pride in defending and identifying with and enjoying that sort of thing. That's more difficult to measure. So then I guess go to book sales and communities of discourse. But that's not the only. So in my more extended version, I kind of talk about if you look at evangelical consumer culture, it is you'll find diversity there, right? InterVarsity Press books are going to be in there, and Rachel Held Evans, but then you can start kind of looking at sales, looking at in the relative popularity of more conservative versions of evangelicalism and more liberal. And I know Amy, sitting right here, has done some interesting work on evangelical popular culture and why conservatives and how conservatives have come to dominate that space. And I think then, and ask some questions about what are then the implications for further shaping that movement when, if you want a Christian product, chances are, where do you go for that? Lifeway, well, they have some pretty clear litmus tests for what gets sold through that distribution channel and what they reject. If you want a Christian saying on your wall, you go to Hobby Lobby for it. Well, which kind of products do they sell? Which products do they not sell? So how are they then further shaping this cultural identity and reinforcing these notions? How do you measure that as a political scientist? I guess I would leave that to you.
I actually know more about Hobby Lobby than I do about Duck Dynasty, since I go there on occasion. But when I walk in there, there's not signage that says evangelicals come over here for some good literature or whatever. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, how do I know that sign for farm fresh eggs or whatever, suggests?
Yeah. Okay, so this is my kind of cultural spin, but what I will say is what you will find is when you walk in the door, best-selling evangelical books, right? Clearly cultivated. And then if you follow Christian women on Instagram, if you follow, Christian women in social media, you will then see how this is worked out and how their religious faith is in fact wrapped up in this larger sense of consumer culture. And it's not just farm fresh eggs. I think beauty is a really interesting space of analysis here. Beauty, femininity, masculinity has its own, the strong masculinity, and so on. Guns, all of that is kind of a part of this picture.
I really like what Kristen's done with the kind of cultural analysis of this, but it's of course reciprocal. Hobby Lobby, is like in a Supreme Court case. And so we're not going to go to Michael's. Yeah. We're going to go to Hobby Lobby because we're evangelicals, right?
Absolutely.
I really want a chicken sandwich today, but I really admire the Cathy family stance on same-sex, on marriage and the integrity of marriage, and so we shop at Chick-fil-A anytime we get. And so there's this cultural creation and these identity groups which become really, really difficult to disentangle, which doesn't help you with your methodological question.
Sure.
Jim.
Yeah, I think Marie raised some very interesting questions when looking at the evangelical community and the positions it's been taking. And it kind of reflects a lot of the current literature on populism across the world in the attitude that academics have toward these movements. And there's a very critical body of literature that sees populist movements, of which evangelicals right now are a good example, as having all these awful characteristics. And yet there are others who see that there are legitimate kinds of concerns. And I guess my question, and I gave a paper yesterday which is kind of alarmist, I guess, in a real sense. Kristen is nodding there, so I guess I shaped her up. You know, there are those legitimate questions that Marie was mentioning, and how do we create an environment, especially with the kind of religious input that we have into our political system? And by the way, white evangelicals voted 80% for Donald Trump, no matter how you define it.
Right.
You can take Bevington, you can take a religious tradition approach, you can take self-identification, and they really get at different kinds of groups, but it's all 80%, right? So that argument is just moot. But how do we develop a religious politics in which we can raise these kinds of legitimate issues without going to the extreme that Donald Trump has in using these things, and how do we get religious people to react to these things in a more reasonable fashion? One of the things that bothers me about evangelical politics is, as I pointed out yesterday, it has a lot of these bad process characteristics. And that's some of the factors that Trump has tapped into. Impatience with compromise, impatience with the normal political process, looking for a strong leader. And what do we do to change that?
Anyone?
Excuse me. I don't know that I can actually give a great answer to that question. As I heard you talking, I think to myself that it would be wonderful if people could actually not assume that just because someone, you know, I would imagine, maybe it's a stretch, that there's probably somebody in this room who voted for Donald Trump, right? Maybe not, but I'm just going to take a guess that there is. And so just to not assume that the worst things about someone, that they may have actually had a legitimate policy concern for why they thought that Donald Trump would be the better candidate. And this goes back to my point about politics being, in national elections, a binary choice. I mean, you had Hillary Clinton, you had Donald Trump. And so I think that it probably comes down to a sense of respect, judging not, you know, like withholding judgment, and being willing to consider the other person's point of view, and maybe actually thinking that maybe you might be wrong, right? I always think to myself in politics that one has to entertain the notion that maybe, just maybe, they're the one who's wrong. You know? Excuse me. All right, I'm trying to think of the second point that you made. I'm not sure it's going to come to me. It'll come back to me.
Obviously, I'm going to give a very different answer. As a theologian, I feel left out of this conversation. It's dominated by sociologists and historians and scholars of political science. I think what is authentic evangelicalism is defined by theologians. So I'm just going to put it out there. Okay, I just really resent that sociologists and media people are the ones defining evangelicalism. Just because someone says they're evangelical, to me means nothing at all. Mm-hmm. I don't even know what they mean. I have to ask more questions to find out what they mean. To me, it's a spiritual, theological ethos, not a movement, not a political ideology. It's not ideology at all. Ideologies get crammed in and around it. But as a theologian, I really feel like during my life as a theologian, theology has taken a back seat. Mm-hmm. in all of this. And we are not heard, we're not listened to by the media at all. I mean, when they think of an evangelical theologian, they think of Robert Jeffress, they think of Jerry Falwell Jr., they think of Franklin Graham, who are none of them are theologians. But there are those of us who studied evangelical theology, its history, its background, going back to Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, the real grandfathers of evangelicalism, and could help them to understand what evangelicalism really is as a theological and spiritual ethos. But that's just been completely forgotten and swamped by what I call bean counting. And if 80% of evangelicals say or if 80% say we're evangelicals, it means nothing to me, nothing at all. And maybe that's partly because I grew up in a certain kind of evangelical context where we were very suspicious of self-labeling, and we just weren't sure at all.
If you have people who have all the Bevington criteria plus.
Yeah, those have to be fleshed out. Those have to be fleshed out in a certain way. I know David Bevington. He's my colleague. We've talked about this for hours on end. And of course, he just put those out there as, a general rubric, and then he himself will fill them in, and Mark Knoll together will fill them in, Biblicism. Jehovah's Witnesses are biblicists. So obviously he doesn't mean just admiring the Bible or believing the Bible is inerrant. He has a certain idea of what biblicism is in evangelical Christianity. Okay, so just to lay my cards on the table, I accept prototype theory when it comes to defining religious and other types. You go back to the beginnings. You look at the founders. You look at the great names. You look at the great documents. You look at the great events. Duck Dynasty? Evangelical? They're Church of Christ, for goodness sakes. There are some evangelical Church of Christ people, but the Church of Christ have never been part of even the evangelical movement in America. Are they evangelical theologically? Yeah, okay, somewhat, maybe so. But we theologians, I'm really resentful, obviously, and bitter, and that we have really been left out of this conversation on who is an evangelical. And it just can't come down to bean counting because it makes it meaningless.
If I could quickly respond to that and connect it to the conversation last night, I think a more primary question than what is evangelical is what is religion. And that just seems to be kind of behind the scenes here. And I think we might have different answers from throughout this room and from this panel on what is religion.
You first.
Yeah, I'm Ron Stockton, University of Michigan, Dearborn. 4 years ago, I presented a paper at this conference entitled, "Are the Evangelicals an Ethnic Group?" And I noted that at the core of the evangelical movement, there are Scots-Irish people who have their own culture and their own tradition. They feel oppressed. They practice non-integrated religion, non-traditional religion, community-based religion. They do not identify themselves as an ethnic group. If they are the group that more than any other group, when the census two censuses ago, when they asked, what is your ethnic tradition? They're the ones who couldn't answer the question. 20% could not answer the question. We are just Americans. We're not one of these other groups of people who have a country that they identify with. So I'm wondering, would it be better to think of the evangelicals as an ethnic group? And rather, ethnicity brings in a whole range of careful literature that enables you to analyze those people. We say grace and we say mem, and if you ain't into that, we don't give a damn. And USA. This is Scots-Irish culture. They like strong leaders who stand up for them and tell other people to go take care of themselves. I wonder if this makes sense to you.
It makes a lot of sense to me, actually, and I see the Scots-Irish strand popping up in unusual places. And I think it also makes sense in terms of migration patterns and the development of, or the evolution of evangelicalism in the 20th century, kind of Bible Belt to Sun Belt motif. But I also will, I'll add to make your case stronger, that it's really interesting in the popular literature I read on evangelical masculinity, how in odd places Scots-Irish masculinity just pops up. So in David Brody and Scott Lamb's book on, what is it? The Faith of Donald J. Trump. Big book, surprisingly. So they have to be very creative in how they make a case that this guy is one of them. And it's not a theological one. It is, and they talk a lot about his rugged masculinity, his ancestors in the Scotch, Irish, and Viking blood that runs through his veins. And so, yes, I would say I'm definitely seeing that in my research.
I cannot agree at all. To me, African American Christians in the United States are probably the most evangelical, theologically and spiritually, as far as, really embodying that, what that means. And if I'm looking in an area for a really evangelical church as I understand it, I find it among the African American churches better than anywhere else.
I was just going to say, I'm a bean counter, so this would completely, trying to treat evangelicals as an ethnicity would completely upend me. So.
Amy, you can go.
So I just wanted a quick follow-up for Roger, as a member of the media who tries to figure out who to quote as representative of evangelicals, which is an impossible task, but one which we need to at certain times. One of the problems of turning to theologians is the necessity to be able to answer your editor when they say, well, how do we know the scope of their influence? There are lots of theologians, lots of people have no influence over anybody, and some do have some influence, and it's one reason why I suspect in your talk, you mentioned a number of pastor theologians who we can see having an influence either through the
They're pastors, I wouldn't call them theologians.
Okay, but a Greg Boyd.
He has a PhD from Princeton.
Okay. How is there a way for us to, if not measure, at least get a sense of who among the community of evangelical theologians has more influence than not?
Yeah, I'm not sure about influence, but how about Leith Anderson, president of the National Association of Evangelicals? He's hardly ever talked to by the media.
He's quoted a lot, but I'll tell you, my editors would then say, okay, but who's persuaded by him? Who does he speak for?
Okay, so now I have to get critical of the media and your editors, because what they want is controversy and sound bites. And we theologians don't specialize in that.
It's, for instance, so I have often focused on progressive evangelicals, and my editors rightly push back and say, okay, well, but they may be this interesting subculture. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about 15 people? Are we talking about 15 million people? It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is a lot of what I'd call progressive evangelicals have dropped the label evangelical since the Reagan era. And so that is a problem, I admit. And so you have to turn to people who are knowledgeable about evangelical theology and spirituality and ask, who are some evangelicals who maybe don't call themselves evangelicals, but have influence? Christianity Today, for example. Why doesn't the media pay more attention to Christianity Today? It's the major publication of evangelicalism in America. And it's very diverse. Now more than it used to be, of course. So I'm really puzzled. I'm just blown away by the media's penchant for having Robert Jeffress, Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr. As someone who grew up evangelical, my uncle was on the national board of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'll never forget when Jerry Falwell appeared on the Phil Donahue show and called himself an evangelical. And I think I literally fell off my chair. My wife said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "He's not an evangelical. He's not one of us. He's a fundamentalist." So something has happened where people who, in my younger years, were clearly anti-evangelical fundamentalists have taken on the label evangelical, and I see the media as a major culprit in letting them do that. They should know better. There are resources to learn. George Marsden. Why don't they learn from George Marsden?
Tobin's been trying to get I'll just say, no, I think fascinating comments. I just wanted to pick up on something that Marie mentioned whenever she was talking about voters for Donald Trump and their, the penchant among researchers to, again, be looking towards racism and anti-immigrant status and Islamophobia. And I think there's definitely a place for that. But I remember writing, Religion News Service wrote a blog during the campaign, and it's just called "It's Okay to Vote for Trump." And I was saying that as someone, I had never been more diametrically opposed to a political candidate in my life, like just straight down the line. Even on the economic stuff, I'm like, okay, I could go with the free trade. Okay, forget it. But as a political scientist, I knew that the dominating thing was not going to be issues. It was not going to be values. It was going to be party. And people vote for silly reasons, right? And if you took a model of the vote in 2012 for Romney, right, which you didn't have any of this kind of conversation, and used it to predict who voted in 2016, you're going to find 99% of them, 95, 99%, it fits. And when you see the criticism, and I wrote the piece, there were some progressive evangelicals were starting to compare Trump to Hitler and some other things like that. It's like, but you guys also wouldn't vote for Romney, and you wouldn't vote for McCain. Like, you could see the Democrats going one way, Republicans the other. That said, I think that the fascinating thing, the thing that I've learned during it, was watching, there was some theological gymnastics going on. Wayne Grudem was a great example of when Donald Trump was just a candidate saying that no Christian could vote for him. It was impossible to be voting for someone who owned casinos and was thrice divorced, and then was totally for him. And then the Access Hollywood tapes came out, and he backtracked. But then whenever no one else backtracked, he went back in. And so it's those maneuvering, and in the book, The Faith of Trump. I think that I think people can be, like you said, your reasons for voting against Trump aren't the other people's reasons for voting for Trump. And it's probably just your partisanship anyway. But I think how people are in the public and these leaders, and you're talking about the movement, how they portray that, and that might have some long-term impact on things in terms of, okay, you know what, personal morality, it doesn't matter anymore. It mattered before, it does not matter anymore. I think that's kind of a long impact, but I think that trying to get those sort of distinctions about like how people justify because it doesn't fit, they couldn't use the same narrative that they used before.
I think that the whole effort, so on the one hand, we have kind of a scholarly work of trying to say, can you deconstruct the 80%? Can you make sense of that? Simultaneously, there is a post hoc justification for why that was, from inside of why that was necessary to do, and why that was plausible and sensical and all the rest of that. And you're absolutely right about the earlier kind of patterns of voting. The only one other thing that I was going to jump in on a moment ago, but I missed my chance. The microphone went away, so I'll go back and do it now. Is that the dynamic of sort of homogeneous congregational life is really important here, and the assumption that churches are not places where one could engage the legitimate differences on policy issues or candidate issues, because the stronger that argument gets, then that makes us uncomfortable, and we don't like discord. So you go find a church where the people like you, and you can talk about that. I mean, that is a troubling dynamic in terms of any broad sense about what the body of Christ ought to be able to do. So we are about 7 minutes into a break. I'll let you fight over one more question. Yes, you were quick.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm from a town that is like predominantly Republican, and like during the primaries, everybody was like, oh, Trump is a joke. And then literally the night that he like wins the nomination, it was like this overnight shift happened where all of a sudden Trump was like the savior of the country and everybody prescribed to his ideology. And I think that that's a really interesting phenomenon, so I would like you to talk about that a little bit. And I don't think that that is unique to just my town. I think that happened across the country. And then the other thing that I would like you to talk about is like, why were those people who like before had said like Trump is a complete joke, able to bend their faith and like their ideologies to fit with the ideology of Trump and then to support him?
And name the region of the country.
The heartland.
Sioux Center, Iowa, my hometown. So yes.
Well, I think this gets to what you had said, and I'm sorry, I didn't get you, Tobin. The influence of party identification, and it's back to what I said before. I mean, there's a binary choice here between two people, between two parties. So it's just not unusual to have people tearing candidates apart in the nomination process, and then afterwards, you know, having their come to Jesus moment that it's either your party or the other party. Right? Do you want your party to win, or do you want the other person's party to win? So, I mean, that just to me strikes me as entirely normal.
But I think what really confuses some of us is why the Trump supporters who claim to be evangelical Christians can't at least be critical of his excesses, of nationalism, of seeming racism and sexism. I'll just say seeming to be nice about it. And, you know, all the other things that they criticized him for during the primaries, why can't they still say, well, we support him on this and this and this, and we're Republicans, so we support him for his presidential appointments and so forth, but boy, he needs to shape up. Boy, he needs to change. And of course, Franklin Graham has begun to say things like that, which I appreciate. I have to give him credit for that. He said, pray for Trump that his, what was his word, eccentricities or something would be overcome and so forth. But it just seems so weird that evangelical Christian leaders who support Trump can't at least say publicly, well, you know, we support the Republican platform and he's the leader of the party, but we sure wish someone else was president. You know, like, let's impeach him and have Pence, who might be a real Christian, be president. Oh.
Okay, so partisanship is key here, right? Always kind of start there, but then these questions do arise as well. I would say that one factor that you had, yes, a lot of people thought Trump was a joke, and a lot of people didn't know if they could trust him on abortion. And so he needed to do some convincing. By the time he got the nomination, and it wasn't in the judges, right, religious freedom and abortion, there was a strong support before he had secured the nomination, maybe not in Sioux Center, but you could see it building in surveys of white evangelicals. That's what people like Moore and Kidd were pushing back against. But I would also say it's important. Then he became a winner, right? Winner. And power is really critical here. And this embrace of power. And then I would say, as a cultural historian, to look at the history of the last half century of white evangelicalism, and there are so many affinities between their religious teachings and what Trump came to represent. And here I will again draw on Jim's data on populism that he presented yesterday. So rough politics, strong leader. This was a powerful this culture of fear, which was not the inevitable response to changing times. It was a response to changing times, but this rhetoric of fear had been ginned up for at least half a century within evangelical circles by evangelical leaders. And so there were strong affinities that were discovered, recognized, that I think made it very difficult for evangelicals to give the critique that Roger is looking for.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that other than well, we want to win. I mean, I think the pragmatism rises in the midst of this conversation. And, I would have preferred that guy, but we want to win this election because of fear, and we have the stakes, and given the binary choice, we don't like the other candidate. We want to win, and he's our best chance of winning. He's going to shake it's worth exploring. We didn't talk about it. All the shake things up rhetoric, break the system, drain the swamp, all those things that never happened were really important. Please, thank you all for your attention, your patience. Thank them. We can talk over coffee.